it in the future. Right. Oh, it works perfectly. That is very rare for me. All right. So again, welcome everybody to tonight's virtual event. Um, Black soldiers in the Lone Star State during World War II. I'm Danielle Blanco, so I know I'm not a familiar face that some of y'all know, but I switched out with Christy for this event, so I hope you will enjoy my voice just as much as hers. I'm one of the development managers at the Friends of the Texas Historical Commission. We are thrilled to have y'all this evening. For those that are unfamiliar with the Friends of the Texas Historical Commission, we are the nonprofit partner to THC, or the Texas Historical Commission. We provide support for historic preservation efforts across the state. And you can get involved and learn more about us on the What We Do page on our website at thcfriends.org. I also want to just send a huge thank you to those who have donated through this program for this event, past events. We just so appreciate your generous support, and it really goes a long way in supporting our fabulous programs. I saw a few folks on the call that I recognize, so just want to acknowledge all of our THC commissioners, our friends, our friends board members, and some of our colleagues at the THC who are with us. So glad to have y'all. And then if you haven't already followed us on social media, please do so. We'd love to connect with you. And then this is a really great way to just learn about what's happening at the Friends, at the THC, and it's a great way to find out about future events and other programming. You can join us for our next virtual event, which is June 20th. And it's going to be on Japanese Texans, Pioneers of Rice Farming, and it will be presented by Sydney Liu of Rice University. A few housekeeping items before we start the exciting part of the evening. We'd really appreciate if everybody can keep their microphones on mute. I know everybody loves that phrase. We've been hearing it for years, but it just helps really amplify Cale's voice as we go through. We'll have a Q&A, official Q&A at the end of the presentation, but as the presentation is going on, if you have questions, thoughts, comments, stories, anything you want to share, go ahead and put that right into the chat box. I will do my best to keep up with things during the presentation, and then we'll get with Cale at the end to make sure that we answer as many of those as we can. And then tomorrow morning, everybody that's registered for this event tonight is going to get an email with a link to the recording of the event that you can share with friends. We'll also provide any additional resources, book recommendations, anything that Cale may share here today that y'all want to know more about. We'll be sure to share that in that email. Okay, and so with that, I will kind of stop blabbering, but I am going to introduce our phenomenal presenter for the evening, Mr. Cale Carter. Cale has nearly 10 years of experience in public history dating back to when he volunteered at the Buffalo Soldiers National Museum as a teenager. He attended Eastman Tolson University, where he earned a bachelor's degree in history. He was a research fellow in the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship and a living historian with the Texas State Parks and Wildlife Buffalo Soldiers Heritage and Outreach Program. After graduating, he returned to his home state of South Carolina to work as a research intern for Columbia SC-63 and was the curator of exhibits for the South Carolina Military Museum. He is currently the director of exhibitions at the Buffalo Soldiers National Museum and recently curated the Blue Helmets in Action, the 93rd Infantry Division in World War II. So Cale is ready to go, y'all. Cale, we're so excited to hear from you this evening, and I am going to stop talking now, and I'm going to hand the reins to you, my friend.
Thank you, ma'am, for the introduction. I'm normally not really that talkative myself about that stuff, but so today we're gonna go ahead the screen, prepare to start sharing the screen. But today we are gonna be discussing Black soldiers in the Lone Star State, and more particularly talking about really to quantify. We're gonna talk about mostly specifically Black Army units in the Lone Star State during World War II. So to get started, the core objectives of this presentation is one, to cover the major Black units that were stationed in Texas and briefly discuss their service. Now, keep in mind, this is still a topic that there still needs to be a lot of research done on the subject matter. So some of the units I will cover are some of the more well-known units or the units that have available information on them. So as time goes on, and heck, even after I finish this presentation and continue doing research, I may turn up even more units. So, but that's one of the objectives. The second objective is touch on some of the experiences of the units while they were stationed in Texas. And then the last objective is examine the origins and training of the unit stationed in Texas, and more importantly, discuss how we can help preserve or help preserve or tell the history of these units as we go on through the future. So this right here, we have an example of a map of the military posts during World War II. Now, of course, this mostly covers the major Army installations. Some of these became forts, like I think Camp Hood became Fort Hood, later became Fort Cavazos. You have Fort Bliss that basically remained around. But then some of these end up basically disbanding. Like you have Camp Walters that I think that became a major military post and is not non-existent no more. Camp Wallace, which is near Galveston, that doesn't exist anymore, and stuff like that. So even though you have these major bases, only a handful remain today. And of these, you'll see quite a few Black units that come from the ones mostly in Central Texas, but there's a few that come from the areas around Galveston as well. So this is kind of just a brief introduction of the 26 units that were stationed, well, currently, as we currently know, the 26 units that were stationed in Texas. Arguably the largest one is the 2nd Cavalry Division, which had a portion of itself based at Fort Clark. Also the 1855th Service Unit, which was an all-Black Women's Army Corps unit that was stationed at Fort Clark. So far, that's, as far as we know in terms of records, that's the only case we see of a Black Women's Army Corps unit being stationed in Texas. There may be others, but as I said, like, this is based off current research at the moment. You have the 758th Tank Battalion, the 761st Tank Battalion, and the 784th, which were all based at Camp Hood and Killeen. And then, of course, you have the 54th Coastal Artillery Regiment, which was founded at Camp Wallace, Texas, which is not far from Galveston. And continuing the list, you see a mix, mostly engineering regiments. The units I'll point out of note is the 993rd Field Artillery Battalion. And kind of just for a brief, interesting tidbit, during World War II, you had a lot of Black combat units that would be, as the war dragged on, be converted into service units. And the 993rd is an example of one of those. They were converted into an engineer combat battalion, and they were based in Bastrop. So most of these, if you notice, they were either based pretty much again in Central Texas. And then last but not least, the units I personally find pretty interesting, the tank destroyer battalions. Now, at any given point in time, all these tank battalions would have been based at Camp Hood or in the military post around them. So vast majority were based within Camp Hood, but you had a few that was in Brownwood. And I think some was even sent to Camp Swift for training as well. So they were kind of in that area around Fort Hood and the areas in Central Texas. So as I mentioned before, there was current, as far as we know in terms of research, there's 26 major Black units that were in Texas. There's possibly more, but we're still doing research in the process. And as we transition into the first unit we're going to discuss today, I wanted to try to use pictures that kind of serve as the breaking point between sections. And what's interesting about this photograph right here, this photograph of the 9th Cavalry Regiment when it was at Fort Clark in World War II. I want to say specifically 1943. And what is interesting is that this was essentially a change of command ceremony. But what is interesting is that if you look in the background, you see some people that are based on the first floor of the barracks, and that's actually women from the 1855th Women's Service Unit from the Women's Army Corps that's in the background. So this is where we start talking about some of the units. Like, in terms of this presentation, I'm only going to focus on a handful, because if I go through all of them, we're going to be stuck here all day, and we don't have time for that. So, but the first one I'm going to focus on is the 2nd Cavalry Division. Now, what is interesting about the 2nd Cavalry Division, the 2nd Cavalry Division is the third and final all-Black combat division to be raised in World War II. The first one was the 93rd. They were raised in May of 1942. The second was the 92nd Infantry Division. They were raised in October 1942. And then the last one would be the 2nd Cavalry Division, and it was raised in February 1943. Now, what was interesting about the 2nd Cavalry Division is that initially they were spawned from an all-Black cavalry brigade, and from the Cavalry Brigade consisted of the 9th and 10th Cavalry Regiments, but what they did during the war, they sent the 10th Cavalry to Camp Lockett, California, and they became the basis for a Cavalry Brigade there. And then the 9th Cavalry Regiment was sent to Fort Clark in 1942. And then when they authorized the creation of the 2nd Cavalry Division as an all-black unit, they essentially built the Cavalry Division from elements of the 9th and 10th Cavalry. In the case of the 9th Cavalry, they kind of served as a basis for the 27th Cavalry Regiment, was also based at Fort Clark, but also many of the support units that will be attached to the 2nd Cavalry Division, such as the 77th Field Artillery, the 79th Field Artillery, which is actually in this photo here undergoing gas training, as well as the support units. So the interesting part about the 2nd Cavalry Division is that, as I mentioned before, unlike the 93rd, which was all raised at Fort Huachuca, and like the 92nd, the 2nd Cavalry Division was kind of parceled out between two places. The majority of the 2nd Cavalry Division was at Fort Clark, but you also had the detachments that was at Camp Lockett, California. And people may ask, well, why do you have this entire division kind of parceled out over a wide area? And that mainly had to do with the fact that when it came to training a lot of these black combat units in World War II, it really wasn't that many areas where you could literally host the entire division. And pretty much at the time in World War II, the only area where you could really host an entire black combat division was Fort Huachuca, Arizona. They had enough land, they had enough facilities where you can do proper divisional training. But when the 92nd was raised, as well as the 2nd Cavalry Division was raised, they pretty much had them parceled out in other areas. And part of that was because of the facilities, but then other part of that too was that there will be concerns from local populations about having an all-black combat division in your area. Keep in mind, in the case of the 92nd and the 93rd, their authorized strength will be anywhere between 11,000 to 13,000 personnel. And in the case of the 2nd Cavalry Division, since they were kind of formed along the base of the older divisions, they will be actually a little bit larger. So there would be anywhere between, I think, 12,000 to upwards of 14,000 men. So because of that, there was concerns about having this large of a population of black troops in an area. So as a result, they would have most of those units kind of parceled out over areas before they would be trained. And as I mentioned before, what's unique about Fort Clark is that, as far as we know, Fort Clark had one of the few Black Women's Army Corps service units here, and that was the 1855th service unit that was attached to Fort Clark and served alongside the 2nd Cavalry Division while it was at Fort Clark. So one of the interesting things that came up during the war was that when the war was breaking out, there was always a concern about manpower. Okay, how are we going to deploy troops? Each theater needs a vast amount of troops, or basically replacements and stuff like that. And so the other issue that was coming about, especially I would say after 1942, was the concern about support units. Because even though we talk about World War II, we talk about the ground fighting, what is often overshadowed is the logistics trains and logistics supports that were critical in getting the ammunition, the fuel, the food, everything, as well as building the infrastructure such as the airfields, the ports, and all that to the front lines. And so with the U.S. Army, units that they deemed were excessive in terms of combat units would often be the first ones to be converted. And in many cases, a lot of black combat units that would be initially trained for combat roles, such as cavalry, infantry, artillery, and as we'll see later, kind of give a little slight spoiler, tank destroyer battalions, a lot of those units will be converted into service units to help support this effort. But you would have pushback from the black press, where the black press and black leadership will say, well, y'all are like the people or these commanders saying they need more manpower for these offensive operations. You have all these black combat units stateside. Why aren't you employing them in a combat role? And this came up for many black combat units, including the 2nd Cavalry Division. And there was kind of hush discussions about saying within the Army at the time, before around late 1943, early 1944, about saying, okay, we got too many black combat units. One of the issues we're running into is trying to find replacements for these units. So if they go overseas, how are we going to replace the combat losses occurred for these black units? And this actually appears later with the 92nd, but that's a whole nother story. But what ends up happening is that high command starts saying, okay, well, you know what? We don't really need as many combat units, but we do need support units. So what we need to do, we need to start converting these units into like quartermaster battalions, port battalions, engineering units, and stuff like that. But the black press hears about it. They're like, hey, this is a combat unit. They spent years training. You need to employ them in a combat role. And so what ends up happening is that the 2nd Cavalry Division, it says, okay, we're going to go ahead and deploy them overseas to an actual theater of operations. And in the case of the 2nd Cavalry Division, they were deployed overseas in February 1944. And as soon as they arrived in North Africa, they were pretty much converted into service units. Now, the interesting aspect about this is that some people will say that the reason why they was waited to convert into service units there was to kind of get it out of the eye of the black press. But either way, the disbanding of the 2nd Cavalry Division marks the end of not only the initial storied history of the 9th and 10th Cavalry Regiments as the first black regular army units after the Civil War, but this also marks the end of of horse cavalry being used in the U.S. military. Now, what I neglected to mention earlier that made the 2nd Cavalry Division unique, which I should have did a better job of kind of emphasizing, the 2nd Cavalry Division was one of only 2 cavalry divisions raised in World War II, and they were the only ones to actually still use horses. The 1st Cavalry Division, they were initially a horse outfit as well, but then they were deployed to the Pacific Theater, but they traded in their horses and they became infantry. Whereas the 2nd Cavalry Division, they still retained horses, they still did horse drill, and while most of their fellow cavalry regiments were converted into armored units, the 2nd Cavalry Division was still kind of the last holdouts of doing horsemanship and basically riding into battle in horses. So when the division was disbanded and the regiments and units were broken up into service units, it not only marked the end of the 9th and 10th Cavalry Regiments as all black units that had a storied history that went back to the end of the Civil War, but that also marked the end of the use of horses in a combat role for the U.S. Army. And so when we get to this photo right here, this is where we start talking about the 54th Coastal Artillery. And here we got a photo of some gentlemen basically serving as a crew on a 155 millimeter. It was a 155 millimeter. I want to say howitzer. I want to say a gun because there's a difference between howitzer and gun. So when you talk about the 54th Coastal Artillery Regiment, unlike the 2nd Cavalry Division, with which some of its core elements were raised elsewhere, with the exception of some of the support units, the 54th Coastal Artillery Regiment was actually from Texas. They were activated at Camp Wallace in February 10th of 1941, and they end up being one of a handful of black coastal artillery regiments that was raised just before World War II. I want to say they were the 3rd one because their personnel came from the 76th Coastal Artillery and the 77th Coastal Artillery Regiments. What also made them unique during World War II was that they were the only coastal artillery regiment that wasn't really anti-aircraft based. So during World War II, most coastal artillery units essentially kind of fell under the umbrella of anti-aircraft. You did have some of the older coastal artillery, which were basically heavy guns that were designed to defend like port facilities from attacks from ships. So the 54th Coastal Artillery Regiment was pretty much the only black regiment that was kind of trained in that classic use of coastal artillery, meaning that they're designed to have pretty large guns to attack ships that may be attacking port facilities. So while the regiment was activated at Camp Wallace to complete some further training, they was sent to North Carolina. It was specifically Camp Davis, and then from Camp Davis, once the war broke out, they deployed the entire regiment to California to essentially act as harbor defense. And they was attached under Western Defense Command. So when they get there, pretty much the 1st and 3rd battalions of the 54th Coastal Artillery Regiment, they stay on the West Coast for the entirety of the war. Their whole duty on the West Coast is, again, to provide kind of port defense from possible Japanese attack. Now, while I said the 1st and 3rd Battalion remained on the West Coast, probably as defensive forces, the 2nd Battalion was actually deployed to the South Pacific. In fact, they were deployed in October 1942. And in fact, what is interesting is that the 2nd Battalion, they were on the USS President Coolidge. There was a, I think it was the SS President Calvin Coolidge, which was it was a U.S. ocean liner that was converted into a troop ship. And while it's basically putting in the port and getting ready to basically drop off some troops, it struck a mine and it landed on a reef. So the ship stayed afloat long enough to where people could actually evacuate the ship, but then the ship slid off the reef and sunk. Now, it was interesting that the 2nd Battalion of the 54th Coastal Artillery Regiment was on that ship when that happened. All the crew members got off the ship. They got off successfully. The main thing that was lost was their heavy equipment, but also their unit records. So their unit records of the 2nd Battalion, pretty much from its inception up to that point, was essentially lost when that ship was sunk. But the 2nd Battalion would later get converted, and it still retained the designation of a Coastal Artillery Battalion. They would later be converted to the 49th Coastal Artillery Battalion, and they were issued 155 millimeter howitzers, specifically long toms, or one that was nicknamed long toms. And they end up seeing combat service on Bougainville in February 1944. Now, what's interesting about that unit is that when you have this discussion of what was the first Black combat unit to actually see combat service in the Pacific during World War II, some sources would say it was the 93rd Infantry Division, specifically the 25th Infantry Regiment. Some would say it was the 24th Infantry Regiment, but in reality, in many cases, they end up saying that it was the 49th Coastal Artillery Battalion was among the first, if not the first, Black combat unit to see combat action. And in their case, they was providing fire support against a Japanese counterattack on Bougainville that took place in February 1944, approximately like 2 months before the elements of the 93rd Infantry Division even arrived on Bougainville. And I want to say about a month or so before the 24th arrived on Bougainville as well. And so here we transfer into talking about the last major units that we will talk about in the presentation. And this is essentially talking about, well, this photo right here is most about the officer candidate that came out of Camp Hood, Texas, which Camp Hood, Texas at the time was basically the armor training, but also, more importantly for this section, talking about their training of tank destroyer battalions. So what is interesting about Camp Hood and the connection to the Black tank and tank destroyer battalions is that in total, there was approximately 14 some odd Black tank and tank destroyer battalions that were stationed at Camp Hood at any given point in time. 3 of them were Black tank battalions, and they were part of the 5th Armored Group. That was the 758th Tank Battalion, the 761st Tank Battalion, and the 784th. And then you also had 11 Black tank destroyer battalions that were stationed at Camp Hood. Now, what's interesting is that with the Black tank destroyer battalions, they were actually a kind of a product of General Leslie McNair's modernization of the U.S. Army. At the time, the U.S. Army, right before World War II, was going through a major change in process. They were trying to go from having these large square divisions that were essentially kind of built for attrition to more triangularized divisions to make them more mobile. But this way, you also had people the officers observing what was happening in Europe at the time, particularly with Germany basically overrunning Poland as well as overrunning the Western Europe in 1939 and 1940, and they started kind of reorganizing the army based on what they was observing. So many concepts came out of that. I think one of them was the armored branch, other was the airborne branch, but the other one was the tank destroyer branch. And the idea with tank destroyers is that essentially their idea was to basically help defend against tank armored breakthroughs and then basically deal with the armor threat while the tanks would initially go through to support infantry. So with the tank destroyer battalion, of the 11 Black tank destroyer battalions that were formed, there were 4 that were actually raised in Texas. That was the 649th, the 659th, the 669th, and the 679th, which apparently looking at, they love the 9s at the end for some reason. They like the beginning with the 6 and the ending with the 9s. But all of those were raised in the Camp Hood area of Texas. Now, the other tank destroyer battalions came from tank destroyer battalions came from a variety of areas. Most of them came from Arizona, Colorado, Kentucky. Louisiana was very much a big one. And then last but not least, Tennessee. So continuing on the discussion about the tank destroyer battalion aspect of it, of the 11 tank destroyers battalions that were formed between 1941 and 1943, only 3 would deploy overseas and see combat service. And of those 3, only 2 would make it as intact units towards the end of the war. Now, as I kind of mentioned before, because there was such a need for service units, and really as the war dragged on, there was kind of a realization that, hey, we raised a lot of combat units, but we really don't really need as many combat units, but we do need a lot of support units. And oftentimes they would say, okay, well, what units have we raised that are kind of support-oriented combat units that we may not need as many of? And oftentimes the first units that will be on the chopping block to be converted into service units, particularly when it came to black combat units, were tank destroyer battalions, field artillery battalions, and anti-aircraft battalions. And so in the case of the tank destroyer battalions, many of those tank destroyer battalions would get disbanded and converted into quartermaster or truck companies, with some of the experienced soldiers transferring either from the tank destroyer battalions and the tank battalions, and then some of them transfer into the other tank battalions that would be going to see combat as replacements. So of the 3 that I mentioned, there was mentioned before, there's 3 that goes overseas: the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion, the 679th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and the 827th. Now, the 614th would be considered one of the more accomplished of the 3 black tank destroyer battalions. In fact, they were one of the first black units to receive the Presidential Unit Citation in 1945. Specifically, it was 3rd Platoon Company C of the 614th Tank Destroyers that earned the Presidential Unit Citation for actions that were involved around the Battle of Klimbach, which was, I want to say it was on the border between France and Germany. But the 679th, they deployed later in the war, and by the time they arrived in Italy during World War II, they were mostly providing fire support as kind of essentially as augmented artillery to the 92nd Infantry Division, as they were a part of the final offensive in Italy in World War II. And arguably, which the unit that had the most complex service would be the 27th Tank Destroyer Battalion. And the reason why they kind of have a complex service, of the 3 that were deployed overseas, they were the only ones that were a self-propelled unit, which meant that whereas the other guys, they towed their anti-tank guns using trucks or half-tracks, the 827th had vehicles that looked like tanks, but they were not as well armored as tanks. They just had a big gun, and they could, as kind of mentioned in the title, self-propelled. They could drive themselves into position and not have to be kind of handled in position. And with the 827th, there's really not that much explanation in the records as to why they have a complex service. And what I mean by complex service is that when they actually deploy overseas towards the latter half of the war, they participate in a counteroffensive that was called Operation Nord, when they actually helped push back against a German offensive that occurred in southern France. And while they was there, their performance, with the exception of, I think it was a 1 or 2 companies, I think it was like the 2nd Battalion of it, not the 2nd Battalion, but the Company B of the 827th. With the exception of Company B, they said that the rest of the unit kind of had questionable service records. Some said that they basically didn't follow orders. They didn't really know how to handle their equipment properly. And so I've tried to comb through the records to figure out why that's the case. But at least from what I'm finding, looking at the records I've currently came across, some of that had to do with the change in training and the doctrine they experienced while they were stateside. So from what I've read to a certain point, they were trained initially in one type of tank destroyer vehicle. They trained pretty well at it, and they were trained pretty well at direct fire, but they had struggles with indirect fire and stuff like that. So it was quite kind of a complexity with their service record. But ultimately, after that counteroffensive was over, they moved the unit to rear echelon duties, and they said, okay, we're going to take some of these guys and make them into service units, because again, we need service units overseas. Let's just go ahead, take their vehicles. Other tank destroyer battalions need them. Give those tank destroyers to them. Convert those guys into a service unit. So like I said, as a result, the 827 kind of has a complex record, and honestly, it's one of those units, those black units, that's not that much is really known about them, and most of you see, you don't know if it's either true or fiction, and it's kind of the challenge of trying to sift through that to figure out the truth from fiction. And right when we get here, this is when we start talking about the success of the tank battalion. So, as I mentioned before, there were 3 black tank battalions that were stationed at Camp Hood at any given time. That was the 758th, the 761st, and the 784th. And like many black combat units, they spent many years stateside training overseas. I want to say the first one to be formed was the 758, and they were formed in like I have to say mid to late 1941. I can't remember the exact date, but most of them were formed between 1941 and 1942. And pretty much from that point, they spend their entire time training, and most of the units don't deploy overseas till 1944. The 758th, they actually leave from Camp Hood. They go to Tennessee. They participate in Tennessee maneuvers. They do quite a large amount of training, and then they deploy, and they end up serving with the 92nd Infantry Division as kind of an attached unit, and helping provide fire support and helping provide mobile fire support for the infantry units attached to the 92nd. The 761st arguably is the more well-known of these black tank battalions. They were arguably the first one to be deployed overseas. They deployed overseas in October 44, and they're among the first ones to see combat of the black tank battalions. And both the 761st and the 784th will play a critical role in the liberation of Western Europe, with the 761st ultimately making their way to Austria, like helping with the liberation of concentration camps, and even, I want to say, linking up with the Soviet forces as well. That was critical in helping encircle Germany from the east as well. And so from here, this is where we start talking about the lives of the soldiers when they were stationed in Texas. Now, in this case, this was to be an example of kind of one of the many dances that would be held. Dances were pretty critical in kind of helping keep up soldiers' morale, because, again, you spend most of your time training, but you also want ways to either basically interact with the local community, stuff like that, and keep your morale up other than just soldiering. So when we talk about serving in Texas as a black soldier in World War II, there's this major thing that cannot be avoided, and that's talking about Jim Crow laws in Texas. So Jim Crow laws were prevalent in Texas, and also when you look at the military, the Jim Crow laws were not only integrated into the local culture of Texas, but also into the military culture as well. One of the things that tends now to be covered as much is that when you think about the military, especially in World War II, was very much a Southern institution. And a lot of the officers, they came from the Deep South, that were trained in the Deep South. So a lot of the Jim Crow laws that were informative and that were critical in kind of maintaining social order in the South also bled into military culture as well. And you end up seeing this in the case of Texas manifest in a few ways. One of the main cases that you tend to see with black soldiers is Jim Crow involved when it comes to riding on the bus. Now, when it came to riding on the bus as a black person in the South during that period, is that, one, you had to move to the back of the bus, but in many areas, as more white folks got on the bus, you had to move further back to accommodate that increasing number of white folks that will be on the bus. And this actually leads to 2 documented cases that one has a lot of documentation, and the other is kind of sparse in documentation. So the first one involves Private, I'll make sure I get his name right. Private Charles Recco. So in the case of Private Charles Recco, he was actually a military policeman that was in Jefferson County. He was riding on the bus, and he actually was behind the color line. He was behind in the section of the bus where he was supposed to be. But apparently they felt that he wasn't in the right section. I think they said apparently his knee was over the line. So that led to a confrontation, and ultimately he will be shot. Now, some sources say that he was shot, but he survived, and then other sources say that he was shot and that he will ultimately die from his wounds. But that ends up being a situation that you see that's pretty prevalent, and this happens, I want to say, in 1942. And keep in mind, this doesn't just happen in Texas. This happens in many parts of the South. But then a few years later in 1944, a similar experience happens to a lieutenant named Jackie Robinson. Now, in the case of Jackie Robinson, with the situation that occurs with him, he's riding on a bus on the post trying to get back to Camp Hood, and he's actually sitting beside the wife of an officer that he knows. So they're sitting and basically in the section they're supposed to sit in. They're talking, but then more people get on the bus, and the line is basically moved beyond them. So they come on the bus. They tell them you have to move beyond. You have to move beyond this. Get into the color section. Then at the time, he's like, "Wait a minute, I'm actually in the right section, X, Y, and Z." So it ends up being a confrontation, and ultimately, this confrontation leads to him being court-martialed. Now, the interesting aspect about it is that at the time, Jackie Robinson was an officer in the 761st Tank Battalion. And when this was occurring, the commander of the 761st, when they brought the charges, say, okay, we're going to charge Jackie Robinson, we're going to court-martial him. The commander was like, I'm refusing to do that. We're about to deploy overseas. He's one of the better officers we have. This doesn't make sense to try to bring an officer up on court-martial charges, especially for something as trivial as this bus thing when we're about to deploy overseas. So what ends up happening is that because the commander of the 761st refuses to sign the paperwork to charge Jackie to get the court-martial process started, they transferred Jackie Robinson to another black tank battalion, and I think it was in this case it was 758. They transferred to the 758 to a commander who will be more willing to sign the paperwork. They sign the paperwork, they start the court-martial proceedings, but he actually has some support from people like Joe Lewis and other people, and ultimately the court-martial charges against him will be dropped, and he would end up going on to be honorably discharged. Now, pretty much after that, he basically separated. He's basically spent most of his time after that just pretty much stateside. And after he separates from the Army, he spends most of his time basically training. And then from there, he goes on to play for the Dodgers. So then the last thing I have to bring up on here, too, is the impacts of events such as the Beaumont Race Riot of 43. So when you talk about black soldiers serving in the Deep South, there's multiple things they have to deal with. In addition to Jim Crow, they have to deal with directly, they also have to deal with stuff that may be happening to their families. So in the case of the Beaumont Race Riot of 43, while you may not have soldiers that were directly involved, you have the stories of black soldiers who may have family that was back there and hearing what's going on and how that would negatively impact morale. So you combine all this with also other things that would also happen in Texas where there was German and Italian POW camps, and oftentimes, whereas black soldiers could only be restricted to certain parts of town, could only go to certain places to eat, the German and Italian POWs, who were, again, prisoners of war, they had essentially free reign to go where they would like in some places. And stuff like this would take a toll on the morale of black soldiers during this time, not only in Texas, but in other areas of the country as well. So as we get towards the end of the presentation, we talk about the legacy of black units in Texas and World War II, and kind of understanding, okay, why this stuff is important. So when it comes to highlighting these units, particularly the lesser known black units, it just shows how important black soldiers were in Texas. When you talk about the gearing up for World War II, a lot of these soldiers not only came and brought like certain aspects with them, but they brought money in terms of the economy, but then they also could bring kind of what we call kind of the cultural exchange, where you have certain things that got to be exchanged and stuff like that. Now, in addition, learning about these units provide an opportunity to develop a more well-rounded historical narrative of Texas during World War II. Oftentimes, when we talk about Texas in World War II, the focus tends to draw to certain aspects. And when you talk about these black units, they add in another element that is not really as well covered. When you talk about the experience of Texans in World War II, that's talking about not only Jim Crow laws, but also talking about kind of just a general experience of these soldiers, like how their day-to-day lives was. Did they interact with locals? Did some of these soldiers from Texas? Did some of these soldiers actually stay in Texas after the war? Or did some of these soldiers who were from Texas went through the military? Did they go elsewhere and what did they kind of take with them that came from here. And then, of course, the last thing is understanding the legacy of these units and understand that the legacy of these units in Texas provide an opportunity to understand certain complex conditions that are currently existing and improve upon them for the future. So understanding kind of the long legacies of what these soldiers experience, how does that impact certain dynamics that occur today? And more importantly, how can we address them? Do we address them by highlighting these lesser known units? Do we address them by acknowledging their service? Like, how do we go about addressing it? So, and that is pretty much it. Here's the list of my sources that were used. These were some of the sources. There's some others out there I couldn't really fit all up in here, but some of these were direct sources. Some of these were kind of used to help kind of get the core outline. And that is it. So any questions? Anyone have any questions so far?
Yeah, Cale, thank you so much. It's just absolutely incredible. We really appreciate you being able to amplify these stories. A few folks are dropping some questions in the chat, and just a reminder, everyone, if you have a question or a story or a comment or anything, feel free to drop it in. So I'll just start here at the, sorry, there we go. All right, so we've got one that says, in World War I, there was a race riot in Houston involving the construction of the training camp in what became Memorial Park. Does that impact the likelihood that Texas would expect Black units to riot?
It did and it didn't. So the thing to keep in mind was that pretty much, I want to say, ever since the Spanish-American War, a lot of the southern towns had concerns about Black soldiers being stationed in the Deep South. And I think I kind of alluded to it early on about the fact that the reason why I was concerned is because you have a population, and on average, like in the case of, like, I'll say, I think it was a Tampa riot back in 1898, you had a case where you had 4 Black regiments who total strength was about anywhere between 1,000 to 2,000 men who were armed and were trained in how to properly fight. You're talking about a small Black town, that population balloons over. A small town in the Jim Crow South where you may have only 100 or 200 Black folks, and then suddenly the Black population balloons overnight to where not only does it balloon overnight, but you have a case to where these guys can actively challenge the local Jim Crow laws and actually probably overpower the Jim Crow laws too. So to try to give a more direct answer, when it came to the impact of the Houston riot of 1917, it, in a way, in some ways, it kind of reaffirmed what the South had the concerns that the South had about Black soldiers, not just Texas. So in the case of the aftermath of the Houston riots, one of the immediate aftermath was that in the Deep South, a lot of states were on alert. They're like, okay, any Black unit who is coming to the South, we got to make sure they follow certain guidelines. If they refuse, we got to get them out of the state. And this actually happens in my home state of South Carolina with the arrival of the 369th Infantry. So the 369th Infantry out of New York, they come to Camp Wadsworth, which was in Spartanburg, South Carolina. I want to say I think it was about a month or so after the Houston riot. And when they're there, there's this major concern from the leadership in the town, like, hey, wait a minute, we heard about what happened in Houston. We don't want the same thing to happen here. And so you literally have these moments where anytime soldiers would go into town, it would get tense because if a Black soldier refused to follow Jim Crow laws or even question them, it's like, okay, we got to nip this in the bud immediately. Make sure that they don't have arms, make sure they don't have anything because they can be reused. And when you fast forward to World War II, as far as I know currently, there hasn't been any major incidences that were similar to the Houston riot occurring in Texas during World War II. There might have been some small scale incidences, but again, like I said, we're still doing research to figure out what exactly happened in Texas that would be similar. Now, across the border in Louisiana, there was quite a few. There was the Lee Street massacre that occurred, and that occurred, I think, in early 1942. So, in short, to try to be concise and answer the question, it did lead to some concerns about having Black troops in Texas, and not only in Texas, but other parts of the South. But at the same time, when events like that happen, in some cases it sparked concern, but in other cases it just confirmed it just kind of confirmed a belief that was already existing there. Okay, well, if we have these black soldiers here, they're armed, these guys don't want to follow Jim Crow laws, they need to be kind of put in place or get brought out of our town. And that's why in the case of Texas, like I said, like if you look at where a lot of these guys were stationed, like, okay, Camp Hood had a lot of black units, but at the time, Camp Hood is kind of far away from many major civilizations. I think the closest one would have been Austin and stuff like that. The Second Cavalry Division there at Fort Clark. Fort Clark is still far away from major areas, but when you look at a lot of these black units, you don't really see any unit larger than a battalion being stationed in certain areas. And depending on the battalion, you're only talking about anywhere between 800, probably 1,000 soldiers. And oftentimes in a situation like that, with these soldiers being stationed at these bases, it's not just the black soldiers being stationed there. You have white soldiers stationed there as well. So having the white soldiers kind of act as a buffer to make sure that, okay, well, if something does go awry, we also have these guys to help augment the military police, these units, but then also local law enforcement to kind of put a check on this. Wait, does that answer your question?
I'm gonna say yes, but actually, Cale, would you mind going back to the last slide so your contact is still up there? And I say that only, oh yeah, he said thanks, Cale. Just so folks, you know, if there are follow-ups to these questions, I'm sure Cale would love to hear from you. So, all right, let me scroll back up here. So Deborah asked, when did the Army integrate? And then what about Latino soldiers? How were they classified? If that
so, oh, nice, a two-parter. So I'll try to answer without getting too long. So the Army officially integrated in 1948. Now, unofficially, the Army did some experimentation with integration here or there, but it was mostly about on a practical level. So technically, the earliest case of integration was 1941, where the first Second Cavalry Division, well, hopefully this doesn't cause any confusion, but the first alliteration of the Second Cavalry Division before it became an all-black unit was technically an integrated division. It had, I think it was the all-black 4th Cavalry Brigade, and then there was another brigade that was all white. So they were technically integrated as early as 41, but you don't really see it really taking effect until the official order goes out in 1948. So 1948, the executive orders, hey, we got to integrate the military. And really, the military doesn't really fully integrate until after the Korean War. Like, so when the Korean War starts, like, in fact, there's a paper I may have to send to you and kind of share with the group. It was a special report from the U.S. Army that I think that was dated either March or April 1949, and they literally went through and had a list of the number of black units that were still segregated, even though the order to integrate went out in 1948. And I want to say at the time it was like over 250 separate black units that were segregated. And the Korean War kind of helped speeds it up in certain cases. So like by the time you have the end of the Korean War in 53, many of the frontline combat units start becoming integrated, but you still had like segregated units that were stateside and training. So you don't really see segregation really end until 1954 in the U.S. military. Now, as for the second question about Latino soldiers and how they were classified, back then, majority of Latino soldiers would have been considered white. Now, with that being stated, it was essentially kind of based on the color line, basically. So if you were a Latino, but you could pass for white, most likely you went to a white regiment or a white unit. If you was a dark-skinned Latino, you will be classed as basically colored and you'll be thrown in the black unit. And so because by and large, Latinos were essentially classed as white, I think Latinos didn't really start becoming a separate group, I think, until later. But the interesting part about that is that there are a few cases here or there where you see, even though Latinos being classified as white, they would face discrimination in white units. So like you had, I want to say, I think it wasn't the 45th, but it was another unit where, and this actually was an engineering unit, I want to say. So there was a Cuban American who was in a white unit. He passed for white, he was in a white unit, but he still spoke Spanish from time to time. And because of that, they were like, he caught a lot of flack for it. So he actually volunteered, said, "Hey, I want to be transferred to a black unit. Like I'd rather, like I don't want to deal with this no more. Just transfer me to a black unit." And ironically, when he arrived in that black unit, he didn't face the same level of discrimination. In fact, he was kind of welcome. So as a result, I say, well, when I was with this black unit, I actually felt more welcome there than I was in a white unit. But like I said, it's kind of isolated cases here or there, but by and large, most Latino soldiers would have been classified as white. In fact, I want to say when you look at most of the Latino Medal of Honor recipients, most of them came from white units. As far as I know, I don't think there was any Afro Latinos who were awarded the Medal of Honor in World War II. So
That's so fascinating. All right. So Daniel asked, what percent of soldiers stayed on to live in Texas, and did those who stay head into the bigger cities?
So as of now, unfortunately, I don't have the exact percentages. Most of the black soldiers who came from Texas tended to return to Texas, with the exception of a handful here or there. The only way I think we could probably break down the percentages, and like this is actually kind of a dream of mine to actually have, like there's a series of books that Texas published after World War II, and I think it was called The Fighting Men and Women of Texas. And it was a 5-volume series that had like some of the soldiers that were from Texas and kind of like when they returned and who they were from. So it was that, and then also another series of books I think that individual counties kind of published too, that kind of mentioned the black soldiers who came from their counties. And most counties, when they mention those soldiers that came from their counties, most time they were returning back to their counties. You don't really see that many cases of black soldiers who are from those counties kind of leaving, like pretty much saying, okay, well, World War II ended. Okay, well, I'm in California. I'm staying in California now, I guess. So like you have cases of that, but in terms of the numbers, unfortunately, I can't give you the exact percentage breakdown at the moment. Hopefully, I can give you that percentage breakdown in the future, though. But as to the last question, they say, did they stay headed to the big cities? I want to say most of the guys you see that came from Texas, a good majority of them did come from pretty much either large cities or East Texas. So by and large, most of them did come back. I want to say there was a few that was from smaller counties. Most of the guys that did come from those smaller counties. Some of them did went back, but again, it also depended on the other aspect that is not really being covered either, and that's the work opportunities. So if you fight in World War II, you come back, you're from a small town, but there's no job opportunities there. Where you're gonna go where there's a job opportunity or where you can find housing. So if you can go to a big city, you can find a job or housing, then most likely if you're from a small town and you're black from a small town like in East Texas, and you say, okay, well, I come back, there's no job opportunities here. Let me go to like Houston, or let me go to Dallas and try to find work there. Some cases they're pretty fortunate to find work there. In some cases, it's a little bit difficult. So you see like some of those guys kind of being a part of that great migration and heading other areas too. So but to answer your first question, we don't have an exact percentage, but in terms of those who they say there was a mix of those who did remain in their hometown and some who basically went to the city.
That's awesome. There's a few more questions, but wanted to share. There's a few comments on here. So JC Morgan just said, "Well done, Mr. Carter. Please tell your dad I said hi." For Dr. JC Morgan.
I wonder if Dr. Morgan used to be our dentist. I wonder.
And then Deborah has said she just finds this so fascinating, and she's been ordering books from the library as this presentation is going on, and she can't wait to delve into this subject deeper. So again, thank you for amplifying these stories. We got a few more questions. So Donna asked, were Black soldiers and white soldiers paid the same?
Yes. So the only time you see the case of Black soldiers and white soldiers not being paid the same is in the Civil War. So during the Civil War, when they formed the initial, like, I don't know if y'all remember, like, well, back in the in like 89, there was a movie called Glory, and they had that scene where, oh, they don't want to pay you properly, and they have a strike. Well, the 54th, from my understanding, didn't go through that, but as far as I know, but you do see that issue showing up with early Black regiment that was formed in the South. And this was due in part to kind of contraband, the laws around contrabands at the time. So when it came to Black folks who fled from slavery, that fled to Union lines, initially they were classed as contraband, and they're like, okay, well, you can do work for the Union Army, but we're only going to pay you, I think, like $10 a day for your labor. I think the lowest paid infantry, the lowest paid soldier would be 13 an hour, 13 a day. So I think it was 13 a day or 13 a month. I know somewhere some Civil War guys about to attack my head out of nowhere. But the thing is, with the pay scale, the initial pay scale for the early blackers that was being formed was kind of based off the contraband pay scale that was issued. So as a result, you saw kind of black soldiers saying, okay, well, we don't mind fighting, but we want to be paid the same as other soldiers in the Union Army. And so as a result, that pay scale is ultimately evened out to where they're paid the same as the regular soldiers in the Union Army. But pretty much from that point onward, anytime you had black soldiers in the Army, they would be paid the same amount as white soldiers in the U.S. Army. Now, with that being said, when it came to stuff like the GI Bill later, in theory, they're supposed to have the same access as any other person that served in the military. But when it came to the practical application of where they could and couldn't use it, that's where you saw restrictions, and that's where you would see kind of the differences between the white soldiers and black soldiers when it came to like the application of being able to use a GI Bill or low interest loans, to where, okay, well, you come back from World War II, you have a GI Bill, you want to use your GI Bill to go to college. Well, okay, well, depending on where you are in the South, your only option may be a historically black college or university. Or when it comes to using your home loan, the home loans, for example, or accessing home loans, if a bank gives you access, you as a black soldier may be restricted to a certain area, like maybe restricted to a red line area where you can get a home, but it can't accrue in value and stuff like that, like another home. So in terms of while they was in the service, they received the same pay scale, but like once they were outside of the service, when it came to the application of benefits and stuff like that, it would kind of differ based on where they were and local municipalities and stuff like that. So.
Okay. Deborah wants to know, were these soldiers enlisted or drafted?
So majority of the soldiers that would have been in Texas would have been a mix of draftees and volunteers. So I want to say the way that it worked in World War II was that pretty much from December 7th, 1941, I want to say until I know the archivist Jason, he probably mauled me out for this one, but I want to say it was either late 1942 or early 1943. Soldiers had the option to volunteer for service, and if they volunteered, they actually kind of had a little bit more preferential treatment on where they wanted to do what they wanted to navigate. But the reason why I say until about 1942 is because between December 7th and that period, you could volunteer, but after that, you were just getting drafted either way. So when you have stories of soldiers saying that, okay, well, like they would say I was inducted in 43. Well, they were brought in as draftees. So even though they might have wanted to volunteer, they were just inducted in either way. So they're part of the Army of the United States. But as for the other aspects, some of them, it was a mix of enlisted. Like when you mean by enlisted, like there's mostly like guys that rank from private first class up to like sergeant major. Majority of the black soldiers in Texas would have been enlisted soldiers, but you did have quite a few black officers as well. Like as I mentioned before, Jackie Robinson, he was a commissioned officer. You had in many of these black combat units, particularly the ones that would go overseas, they would start off with primarily white commissioned officers and black enlisted, but by the time that unit would deploy overseas, you would have at least some black junior officers, like some black lieutenants, possibly a captain or so. So like you would have black commissioned officers, but they were like junior officers, or at the most, well, either platoon commanders or in some cases company commanders. But by and large, majority of the soldiers were enlisted, and after a certain period, they're mostly draftees. So.
All right, I'm having to scroll around here. Were many Black draftees or volunteers rejected due to poor health or inadequate education?
Yes, there actually was some. So there's a book. Well, actually, this is one of the sources, The Employment of Negro Troops in the U.S. Army During World War II by Ulysses Lee. One of the issues they said that they had one of the issues that is brought up during that study when it came to recruiting of Black soldiers or the inducting of Black soldiers was education level and health issues. But I think they said in the case of the book, they mentioned particularly venereal diseases. And so as a result, you had soldiers that would say that, okay, well, they may not have had the same level of education, say, okay, well, we probably can't bring them into service. Now, some soldiers were drafted either way in terms of education, and then they'll be brought up to speed while in the military, like kind of receiving like basic education and gaining some education that way. But you did have soldiers that were rejected based on health issues and education level. And I want to say also you had something that was rejected because of the industry, because part of the reason why in certain parts of the South, you did see Black soldiers come from the South, but might have saw only a certain amount that came from the South is because a lot of the soldiers that was from the South worked in agriculture. Agriculture was considered important to the war industry. So like you can only take but so many from like essential duties or essential jobs. So it was a mix of health issues that would cause soldiers to be rejected, and it will also be a mix of education level and active that kind of built to play a role in what would happen later about why certain Black units were understaffed or they had issues finding replacements because they couldn't really basically induct enough replacements to help staff up these understrength Black units that will occur a little bit later on.
And I want to say Cheryl popped into the chat that Union soldiers were paid $13 a month. So you're right on that number there. And then there is a question here. If you know, how did the Black casualties compare to the white units?
So when you talk about Black casualties in World War II, I want to say now again, percentage-wise, I can't remember the exact percentages in World War II, but where you see the mass casualty numbers is actually ties into a later conflict, the Vietnam War. So there was this kind of whole thing about Black soldiers that were like, even though they were, I think I forgot the exact percentages, but they were disproportionate number of casualties in Vietnam. That was true. I'm gonna say in '65 and '66. So because again, during that period between Korea and Vietnam, you had a lot of Black soldiers that would get inducted into the service. Some volunteered, and a lot of guys ended up in combat units. And because of that, in the early stages, I think from like November '65 till about I think November '66, Black soldiers did make a disproportionate casualties in comparison to their percentages in the field. Now, in the case of World War II, I want to say it's a little bit different because in the case of World War II, I'll say in terms of combat divisions, the Black combat division that had the most number of casualties was the 92nd Infantry Division, and I want to say I think they had about, I can't remember the exact, I think it was like either 1,000 or 2,000 men that was killed and wounded. So, and for comparison, most Black units that were combat units, many of the Black combat units did take casualties. Like I know, like the 761st took casualties, the 784th did. I think the 827th took some casualties as well, but their casualty numbers were relatively light in comparison to other combat units. But then we have to add in the context of when they were deployed and what operation they seen service in. So the reason why the 92nd has such high casualty numbers was because when they were deployed to Italy, most of their casualties came in the operations kind of leading up to, I think, was the Gothic Line. And then also a lot of casualties came from the Christmas counteroffensive of I think it was December 1944, where you had the fascist Italian forces essentially pierce through their line and created mass casualties. In comparison, you had other units like the 93rd. The 93rd took, in comparison to the Wikipedia will say, oh, they only took like 10 casualties. They took way more than that in Bougainville. But in terms of other combat units in the area, they took a lot less casualties. But again, why was that the case? Well, in terms of when they were deployed to the Pacific, they were deployed to when the islands were quote unquote secure, but they really weren't. But then you also had to where the soldiers would be like, one minute they may be doing combat duties like patrolling, but then they'll say, okay, well, we're pulling you from the line. We need you to build fortifications. We need you to build up these supply areas, or we need you to help offload a ship. So part of the reason why Black casualty numbers were lower was partly because of when they were deployed during the war, what actions they might have seen in comparison to, say, white units, but then also the fact too that some of those units will be pulled from they'll be pulled from combat duties to do essentially service details. So
Right. Scott Franklin asked, how were Black POWs treated?
so during World War II, there's actually, and I'll be honest, I'm actually surprised nobody asked me this in the thing. I probably owe my archivist some money. But there was I was kind of a bet about when anybody come through and ask any Tuskegee Airmen related questions. And so far, this is probably the only Tuskegee Airmen related question that we received at this point. So most Black POWs you see kind of fall into two categories. The POWs that came from the Army Air Force, which is Tuskegee Airmen. And I think there was a book written by, I forgot the gentleman's first name, but I think his last name was Jefferson. And the Black POWs who were captured during the Battle of the Bulge. So the Black POWs that were captured from the Tuskegee Airmen, they mention how when they are captured, the Germans interrogate them. When the Germans and the Germans interrogate them, kind of interrogate and say, okay, well, this is what we know about your background, yada, yada, yada. But they would kind of ask them every now and then, like, well, how can you fight for a country that views you as a second-class citizen and stuff like that? But they were asking questions like that, kind of like the psychological aspect. But by and large, they really didn't. Once they were in captivity, they would be treated pretty much the same way any other POW would be treated. And the other caveat too is that the guys I'm mentioning right now are officers. And what some people don't realize is that when it came to POW rules, is that if you was an officer, you're pretty much sitting out the war. Okay, like especially in World War II, if you was captured by the Germans or people that followed the Geneva Convention, okay, you're an officer, you're captured, you're gonna sit out the war, like kind of just keep yourself busy. But when the other group of Black soldiers that were captured were Black soldiers that were captured during the Battle of the Bulge, and the narratives that kind of surround that were Black soldiers who was from the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion who were overran when they was trying to provide fire support, I think, for the 106th Infantry Division. When they were captured, the Germans gave them kind of a hard time, and they would actually kind of record them for propaganda value. In fact, there's this kind of famous newsreel where you have like these group of Black soldiers kind of staring into a camera kind of blankly. Those are the soldiers from the 333rd when they was captured during the Battle of the Bulge. And in fact, there was one case of a war crime that I think it was the second SS Panzers, second SS Panzer Division. They committed a war crime against some Black soldiers. The more famous war crime, I think it was the Malmedy massacre. But shortly, a few days after that, there was a massacre involving 11 soldiers from the 333rd who managed to escape the initial chaos. They managed to escape. They hid in a farmhouse, and a local Belgian family took them in and actually was trying to hide them, but someone that knew of the family betrayed their location to the second SS Panzers. They took the guys out of the farm cellar, dragged them in the woods, and they just executed them. In fact, they not only executed them, they actually were pretty brutal to them. I think they said when they discovered the soldiers' body, they found like not only gunshot wounds, but they found like stab wounds, gougings, and it was one case where I think the medic was actually who was actually trying to bandage a fellow soldier. They executed him while he was trying to bandage his fellow soldier. So, like, the experience kind of range from like the Black officers from Tuskegee Airmen being treated fairly okay to the experiences of the Black enlisted from the 333rd, where they were treated kind of roughly, where either they were kind of made examples of and say like, hey, this shows the inferiority of Black soldiers, and to the extreme end where like you have the Wereth 11 massacre, where these guys are unarmed. Second S is like, okay, let's go ahead and just execute them and just massacre them. So,
Well, we got one more comment from Mary, who just commented, just saying thank you so much. I really enjoyed this informative presentation. I took my great nephew to the Buffalo Soldiers Museum recently, so
nice.
That is awesome. If anybody else has any questions, again, feel free to drop them here. We can hang on for a few more minutes, but this is Cale's contact information. He's fantastic. He will talk to you about all of this great information if you think of things once you've logged off. And like I said at the beginning, we'll send a link to everybody of this presentation, along with kind of any other resources and things that Cale mentioned during the presentation, for y'all to have to share with friends or to just review again. So thank you everyone so much for joining us tonight. And again, we just so appreciate you joining us, coming to learn, coming with great conversations and great questions. So thank y'all. And Cale, I think we might be saying goodbye to most of these folks. So I'll tell you to have a fabulous night and thank you again. And thank you to everyone else and have a great evening.
All right. Well, thank you. Nice being able to present for y'all again. So.
Yeah. Thanks, Cale. Thank you, everyone.
Let's see. And go ahead. Is it going to me go ahead and leave now? Or?
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and end it. Thanks, Cale.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
All right. Bye.